Who will be Asia's next superpower? India, Malaysia, Indonesia, or Vietnam?
India,
Malaysia,
Indonesia,
Vietnam.
Europe dominated the 19th century, North America dominated the 20th century, and China in particular has been the rising star of the 21st century. However, with old players and new tactics in the game, one major factor has already begun to change everything.
I do like tariffs. Tariffs. Tremendous tariffs. Tariffs that are massive.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff.
The US-China economic relationship is taking a major hit, and surrounding Asian countries have already begun to profit from it. If things continue as they are, which one will make its way into becoming a dominant force in the near future? Let's find out. This is the story of how American tariffs on China are making way for Asia's next superpower, the US-China rivalry. So how has the US-China rivalry been paving the way for others? After the end of World War II, the world was dominated by two powers, the USA and the USSR. The USSR collapsed in 1991, leaving the USA as the only superpower. That didn't last very long, as China started to rise exponentially under a communist system. By the start of the 21st century, China had become a key figure in global power dynamics. The US-Soviet rivalry was replaced with the US-China rivalry, and China kept growing more and more with time. Picture this. This map shows whether countries had more trade with the US or China in 1980. Red means China, and the blue is the US. This map shows the same comparison in 2018. China keeps rising rapidly. For obvious reasons, the US doesn't like that, so the US is trying to stop China, indirectly giving the others a chance to grow. How? Let me explain. China has a massive population of around 1.4 billion people, many of whom were only suitable for unskilled labor until a few centuries ago. At that time, China was one of the poorest countries, meaning people would be willing to work for a minimal wage. China took advantage of its cheap labor and massive population, establishing factories to export products to wealthy countries of North America and Europe. With time, the number of those factories kept on increasing, and soon China became a global manufacturing hub. Although China has diversified its economy over time, its core has always remained its manufacturing industry, even today. Despite making money by selling to the West, China has never been a Western ally on political or military grounds. As China started emerging as the next superpower, the US began to realize that it now shared power on a global stage, and if it continued, it might eventually lose the power it possessed. So the US decided to tackle China by limiting its manufacturing industry through sanctions, trade wars, and Donald Trump's favorite word,
The most beautiful word in the entire dictionary.
it's more beautiful than love.
I have stopped wars with
tariffs. This made Chinese products expensive in Western markets. The US government wanted consumers to move to local products, but we know how high American wages are. Products made in America can never be a cheap option, so it created a vacuum in the market that needed to be filled with a manufacturing industry from another country with cheap labor and a notable population. Investors needed to look for such countries, and some of the best places they could find are in Asia. Let's start with India. But before that, if you enjoy learning more about today's economic stories, be sure to subscribe. India. Throughout modern history, India has remained the second largest country in terms of population. In 2023, it is said to have even crossed China, making it the most populated nation on Earth. India offers cheap labor and a large workforce, making it a suitable option to replace China. India doesn't really get along well with China and holds strong ties with the US, ensuring that the USA won't have to deal with trade wars with India 3 decades later. Since the start of the trade war, many foreign companies have moved their manufacturing plants from China to India, the most notable being Apple. Apple began manufacturing iPhones in India for the first time in 2017. Back then, Apple would only make older or lower budget phones. The iPhone 14 marked the first time manufacturer Foxconn had started building the new model in India as it was launched globally. In January 2023, Indian Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal said that 5 to 7% of all iPhones were being manufactured in India at the time. The percentage has risen to 14 to 15% and is expected to rise as high as 26 to 30% by 2027. India really took advantage of the US-China war, but that isn't the only war it took advantage of. It also took advantage of the Russia-Ukraine war at its fullest. With an oil production of more than 11 million barrels per day, Russia is the third largest oil producer in the world, and it used to fulfill the oil needs of most of Europe. When the US and UN imposed sanctions on Russia, Russian oil became cheap. While fuel prices rose sky high in Europe, India took advantage of the situation and started importing crude oil from Russia, then selling refined oil to Europe. In 2022, India imported oil worth $170 billion, mostly from Russia, and exported $86.2 billion worth of refined petroleum to the European nations. In between, it met the oil needs of its own 1.4 billion population and made some profits from refining the fuel. Many economists and political leaders have predicted India to be one of the superpowers in the future.
India is a middle power on its way, according to some specialists, to become a great power, a superpower.
India is undoubtedly the strongest contender, but it isn't the only one in the race. Let's take a look at Malaysia. Malaysia may not have a population advantage like India, but it has a better infrastructure, a well-off economy, and a higher percentage of skilled workforce to make up for a lesser population. Regarding ease of doing business rankings, Malaysia ranks 12th globally, much higher than India, which ranks at 62, and even China, which ranks at 32. In fact, the only Asian country with a population of more than 10 million ranked better than Malaysia is South Korea. So it's quite obvious why many countries would move from China following the trade wars and tariffs. According to the Malaysian Investment Development Authority, major brands like Intel, AMD, and Bosch established early operations, joined later by Infineon, Micron, and many others. Nvidia is another tech giant with its offices based in Malaysia. Malaysia now specializes in semiconductor chips, as it's the 6th largest exporter of integrated chips globally. 23% of all chips being imported into the USA come from Malaysia, showing strong ties between the two countries and how safe it is to invest in Malaysia from a tariffs and trade wars perspective. One hurdle that some argue Malaysia will be facing is the declining population. Malaysia has a below replacement level fertility rate, meaning people aren't having enough babies to keep the nation running. Many are also leaving the country for better opportunities, and because of racial discrimination and as a result of brain drain, Malaysia is losing the youth that is supposed to build Malaysia's future. But the good thing is Malaysia's geographical position. When you look at Malaysia on the map, you'll see it's quite close to countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar. These are some of the countries with much smaller numbers of job opportunities for their massive youth, and thus many people from these countries are moving to Malaysia, filling the labor gaps left by locals. Malaysia's largest foreign workforce group comes from neighboring Indonesia. This might not last long, as it is its own success story and is another candidate for Asia's next superpower, Indonesia. Indonesia is another major player in this race, but it wasn't like that at the start of the century. In the early 2000s, Indonesia had an unstable economy, skyrocketing inflation, and political instability. So before we get into how they benefited from the US-China tensions, let's see how they started before that. You see, Indonesia is rich in natural commodities, and so it exports everything from oil, gas, and coal to coffee, rice, and rubber. Prices of such commodities grew in 2000, and Indonesia and every other country rich in natural resources started to grow. Those prices started to drop in 2010, and while other nations had setbacks, Indonesia kept growing. How so? Soon after companies started to implement the China Plus One policy in 2013, Indonesia made it illegal to export nickel. For those who don't know, Indonesia is the largest nickel producer in the world, so the cost of raw nickel rose rapidly everywhere except Indonesia, where it got cheaper. You see, nickel is an important element in the manufacturing industry, as it is used in the production of batteries and stainless steel, so the companies that needed to use nickel only had one option: move to Indonesia. Indonesia did this not just with nickel, but with other elements too, forcing companies to move to Indonesia. Indonesia was once among the poorest nations in the region and is now expected to become the 7th richest country on the planet by 2030. Malaysia and Indonesia. That's 2 countries from Southeast Asia, but that's not all. There's another one: Vietnam. Vietnam is not one of those countries that holds a reputation for being rich and wealthy. Rather, it's known for its affordability and low cost of living. This reputation is quite similar to China's reputation in the 1970s, and that is why Vietnam is an ideal location for companies moving out of China. Thanks to the US-China tensions, big tech giants such as Apple, Samsung, Intel, Quant, and Foxconn now operate some of their offices in Vietnam, and their electronic exports grew rapidly. In terms of rankings, Vietnam rose from 47th place in 2001 to 10th place in 2024. Vietnam's economy has grown from $31 billion to more than $440 billion from 2000 to 2024, and is only expected to keep growing. Today, companies from all around the globe are pouring foreign direct investment into Vietnam, and it's not limited to the tech or electronics industry. In fact, Vietnam is the largest exporter of clothing in the region too. Asia is going to significantly dominate the 21st century. While China for sure will be a key player in the New World Order, countries like India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam too are in the race to become Asia's next superpower. We think at least one of these is going to be a big name in the future of the world, and some others too might step up. Let us know what you think. Who, in your view, is going to be Asia's next superpower? Will that be India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, or some other country? Share with us your thoughts in the comment section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to stay tuned. See you with the next video soon.